listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello, and welcome to this June 18th edition of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. John Williams will tell us more about today's guest, Joel Schwartzberg.
Today, we are joined by Joel Schwartzberg, an esteemed writer, speaker, and presentation trainer specializing in communication and presentation skills. Joel's expertise spans multiple industries, including healthcare, financial services, biopharmaceutical science, cybersecurity, personal insurance, and civil rights. He is the author of The Language of Leadership: How to Engage and Inspire Your Team, and Get to the Point: Sharpen Your Message and Make Your Words Matter. His insights have been featured in Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, on CNBC, Toastmaster Magazine, Newsweek, Inc.com, The New York Times Magazine, New York Daily News, The New York Post, and The New Jersey Monthly. Joel is also a former national champion public speaker and collegiate speech coach. He emphasizes the importance of understanding what a point is not, helping people to clarify their message effectively. Joel believes that the audience does not expect perfection. Rather, delivering your point successfully, even if imperfectly, is a significant achievement. Join us as host Melvin E. Edwards dives into the art of effective communication with guest Joel Schwartzberg.
Thank you, John, for that awesome introduction. Joel Schwartzberg, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Mel. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm glad to have you here to talk about this issue. So, since one of your books is called Get to the Point, let's start by doing just that.
Good.
So, what's your favorite advice to get people to say what they mean and mean what they say?
You know, when I say get to the point, it's not an unfamiliar term. We've all been in situations where we think, oh, I wish that speaker would get to the point, or I wish she would get to the point of that movie review, or get to the point of that podcast. So what I try to train people is to understand, or in fact, reimagine what a point is. Because we confuse points with topics and themes and observations and notions and catchphrases and categories. And all of those are not points. And if you don't have a true point, you in fact are rendered pointless. And Mel, this is why people ramble. Not because they're born terrible public speakers or storytellers, but because they don't know the point they're trying to make. And at its base, a point is a proposal. It's a suggestion or a recommendation you're making. You're saying, if you do X, Y will result, and you need both of those pieces. And if you are making a proposal, then you're making a point. But if you're just throwing out there a topic, whether it's podcasting or storytelling or weddings, what's the value of a wedding? What are you saying about podcasting? What's a good way to tell a story or a bad way? You're not really saying anything of value. So a point forces you to propose something of value. And that's what I mean when I say point and get to the point.
Okay. So can you explain to me what strategic storytelling is?
Sure. So we all know storytelling from being bombarded with stories our whole lives. We went to the movies, we see them on television, we read them in books. So we know intrinsically the value of a story and the attraction of a story. I could explain something to you with adjectives and big words, but if I tell you a story that illustrates my point, because we're so connected to and attracted to stories, it makes a bigger impact. So this is why when you go to public speaking conferences or read books on public speaking, there's a heavy emphasis, more than ever, on using narratives and stories, examples, case studies, to make your point. Now, when I say strategic storytelling, this is what I'm sort of talking about. You're not telling a story to entertain, to intrigue, and hopefully not even to introduce. You're telling a story to illustrate. I'm trying to make a point to you, and the story is a vehicle through which that point travels. And if there's no other advice you're going to take from this podcast today. It's this one basic concept. I see people telling stories as part of presentations, but they don't say these crucial words. This story illustrates why we must. This story is an example of why we should. This case study proves why this is the right approach. This story illustrates what's great about my son and what's great about the union between my son and his wonderful fiance. Those words where you are really explicitly making clear the relevance is so important, because it's the relevance of the story that you want your audience to realize, not just the story itself. That's how you turn a story from riveting to relevant.
Well, you made a couple of references to my son's recent wedding. I hadn't really planned to talk about that, but since you brought it up, and I know you've seen the video, I wrote a speech, Father the Groom speech for my son's wedding, and delivered it. And I'm not much of a public speaker. I do have experience in speech writing, but not in speech giving. And you had a chance to see that, so you gave me some pointers, and I appreciate those. I should have sent it to you ahead of time.
Finally, let everyone know that on this date, May 19, 2024, I ask God to give his overflowing blessings to the next Edwards generation as they begin this journey together. Congratulations to Daniel and Madison Edwards.
What would you have done differently if you had given a speech for your son?
Not much. I believe I gave 12 shining moments from your speech, Mel. And that could be a toast training video, because among other things, you didn't rely on adjectives. Oh, my son is this, that, and the other. And his fiance, or his wife now, is this, that, and the other. And you relied on stories. Some people say, all right, well, my son was born on a beautiful morning, blah, blah, blah. He went here to high school. He went here to middle school. Then he got this degree and reached this much. And that's a Wikipedia piece about your son, but it's not what you're there for, which is A, to talk about your experience, which you did, and B, talk about why you're proud, why you're joyful, why you're optimistic about this union. But you did that magnificently. You used storytelling, you didn't rely on adjectives, and every time you were telling me a piece of information, you would tell me your feelings about it. How it felt to witness that, how it felt to be part of that when your son was growing up, and what it means for this moment. So it was always relevant. And as a result, it was very compelling and riveting.
Good. Maybe I'll get paid to do speeches now, but I wouldn't accept the assignment because I don't like talking in front of people, other than in front of a microphone, in front of on a podcast.
Yeah, well, I'm not exaggerating. If someone were giving a toast at a wedding or an event, I would share with them that video and I would say this: don't just think about why Mel was great, because I'm sure people came up to you and go, Mel, that was great, that was terrific, we loved it. But if you want to learn from it, why was it great? And the big question is, what decisions did you make as you wrote that speech, as you prepared for it, and in fact, as you practiced it, that helped make it such a successful moment? And that's the $25,000 question. What decisions you made that effected such a compelling and memorable toast?
It was kind of funny because I was committed to practicing that speech at least once a day for 21 straight days. I wanted because my intention was to practice all the emotion out of it, because I wanted to deliver the speech without emotion. And then when
that was an epic fail.
epic fail. I looked over at my son and he was crying, and he's very unemotional. He's an engineer. He has all the qualities of an engineer. He's very detail oriented. He's unemotional. He's focused on facts all the time. And he's not emotional, but that day he was. And when I looked over at him, it caught me off guard. And maybe that's what made the speech more memorable, because it was emotional despite myself.
Yeah, and emotionalism is not something to avoid. If we go back to Aristotle, and he gives us the three biggest tools for persuasion, you have ethos, pathos, and logos. Pathos is the emotional, argument, or it's the emotional way to reach an audience and attract them. But you did. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to cry, but if you display emotion, however it manifests, that's a powerful method of bringing your audience in, getting their attention at the very least, and having them connect to you. And by the way, Mel, you practiced a lot. And I just want to point out the number one benefit of that practice was you were able to give us eye contact. If you had not practiced your toast, which we see all the time, and which is fine, I'm not, throwing anyone under the bus, but it would look like this. On the day that I met my son, blah, 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 you would have given your entire toast into this piece of paper, and that piece of paper doesn't care. Your audience cares. So you were able to look into your audience. I mean, your eye contact was amazing for someone with a script. And that means that you practiced it so much, it was 60 to 65% memorized. Now, your hat got in the way a little bit, but that hat may be such a
that hat was
part of your character.
That was it was part of my character, but it was also my blanket, my security blanket.
Right. Have it close. So I'll give you a pass on the hat.
Okay, I appreciate that. All right, so let's get back to you for a second here. So your second book is called The Language of Leadership. The Language of Leadership. So what's the biggest mistake leaders make when they're communicating?
The number one biggest mistake starts at the very beginning when they ask the wrong question. They often ask before a speech, whether it's a keynote speech at a conference or whether it's a town hall speech to their team or even a toast to a large degree. The wrong question is, what do I want to say? What do I want to say today? What do I need to say? What should come out of me? What piece of brilliant insight should I share with them? That's the wrong question. So what's the right question? The right question is, what does my audience want and need to know? And then once you know that and can articulate it, you reverse engineer it so that you create a presentation that meets that want and that need. Now, there's a difference between want to know and need to know. Want to know is something your audience is already aware of, but they're interested. They want to know more. Please elaborate. Need to know is something they're not aware of that you need to educate or enlighten them about. But once you have that, you know you will connect with them because you've identified the things they want and need to know. And of course, you bring your own insight, you bring your own experience, but you point it in a direction of something they are interested in.
Okay. So is everybody, in your opinion, is everybody capable of becoming an effective communicator?
Absolutely. A public speaking skill is a skill and not a talent. Nobody is born with that talent. Everybody started being nervous and anxious. Every public speaker, whether that was in school or out of the womb, I don't know where they started, but no one was born innately with this ability. And the other truth is we are all on learning journeys. I've been teaching public speaking since 2006. I was a competitive public speaker in 6th grade all the way through my senior year of college, and I still speak too quickly. And I have a hard time mitigating that. But here's what I do know. I know that I'm not going to speak less quickly by telling myself, Joel, speak slower. That doesn't work. I know I need like a Nicorette, something that I can insert into myself to make myself speak more slowly. And so I do two things. One thing is I speak more loudly because I know I don't have enough breath physically in my lungs. I don't have enough breath to speak both loudly and quickly at the same time. So that slows me down. And the other thing I do is I embrace pauses. So I bring my speedometer down to 0, and it'll go up again. But sometimes that variation is interesting to an audience, but I know I'm always sort of stopping, and overall, my rate will be slower because I stopped, I paused, knowing that pausing is okay.
Okay. So, and you mentioned having been a speaker from 6th grade up through college. How did you become a national champion as a public speaker?
Well, I was never athletically inclined, although I tried, but that just wasn't my thing. So sometime around sixth grade, I was a middle school student in a suburb of Houston, Texas, and my brother had joined what was called the Speech Club. And you could call it a speech and debate club, but there's debate and then there's speech. And speech, you're giving humorous speeches or informative speeches, persuasive speeches, impromptu speeches, extemporaneous speeches. And I sort of loved it, and I got into it, and I learned by my coaching, but I also learned by going to speech tournaments. And I just stuck with it. The more I did it, the more I wanted to do with it. It actually built my ambition and my self-esteem. I didn't know what I was particularly good at until I started doing that. So 3 years of middle school, and I got up to a certain level. High school, I continued doing it. I got up to sort of the next level. And college, it really blew up. Because I came into college, I competed for NYU and for Emerson College in Boston. And I was already at a certain level where I was ready to accept the learning and apply it. So 11 years after I started, when I was a senior at Emerson College, everything culminated in a national championship in an event called After Dinner Speaking, which is a humorous 10-minute speech with a serious point.
That's pretty cool. And you mentioned having gone to middle school in the suburb of Houston. Houston's my hometown. I didn't know you were spending any time there.
So
A-Leaf, yes, I absolutely did.
Oh, you do know? So few people, yeah. I went to A-Leaf Hastings High School.
Okay, over in near the Ship Channel area.
Yeah, you know better than I. It was a long time ago. And I left right after high school. But I had a good time there. And you know, I was born in Long Island. You could tell by the way I say Long Island. It's one word, Long Island. And you know, I came to Texas. Well, that we talk about in Long Island, and the best benefit was being in Texas completely neutralized my Long Island accent, except for Long Island. And I picked up words like y'all and things like that, and walk inline, not online. I forget, put that up versus put that away. So it was really good for giving me a sort of a cleaner speaking style. But I learned a lot, and I learned a lot about meeting new people with new ideas and new approaches to life. And that I think we all benefit from being in diverse communities so we can learn from them.
It's funny how you say your New York accent was sort of neutralized by being in Texas. My Texas accent was sort of neutralized because I went to college in Arkansas.
Wow. Yeah, there are subtleties in having that accent for sure.
That's pretty funny. So I met you on Twitter. And that's not exactly known as a university of respectful communication. So do you critique people when you see them communicating ineffectively in that type of platform?
Never. Because if you spend 2 seconds on Twitter, you know generally criticism is not taken well. And I follow this sort of Buddhist principle, I think. I always forget it, but these 3 questions: is it kind? Is it true? And is it necessary? Is it kind? Is it true? And is it necessary? And if something I'm saying or replying, because we all want to be like, where is that dislike button? I'm going to, but then I ask myself, is what I'm about to say kind, true, and necessary? And if it falls out of that spectrum, I really think twice about it. I write a lot of tweets that I never hit send on, and I just sort of delete because it brings myself a whole lot of trouble. In fact, I recently tweeted that the trolls, whoever you consider a troll on Twitter, they want to continue a discussion with you. They like nothing more than for you to reply in kind, in a mean, malicious way, so they could get into it. So the worst thing you could do to those people, I think, is to just block them. Or if you want to be sort of mean, you could reply, then block them, because I think that reply stays. But it's like how you treat bullies when you're in school. I once saw in the dentist's office the sign that said, "Your teeth are like bullies. Ignore them and they'll go away."
That's funny.
That was about dentistry, but you could take the same thing about bullies too.
About Twitter trolls.
Yeah, the Twitter trolls. So I'm very careful on Twitter, and I consider what I talk about, my public speaking experience, open code. I just like to share it. No speaker is in competition with another speaker. I left competition long ago. So we can all be better versions of ourselves when we communicate and when we tell stories. There are ways to tell stories that are effective, and then there are ways to get lost in your own stories that are ineffective. And interestingly, I see often on Twitter, I have a lot of friends who are authors, people who wrote entire novels, but when you ask them what their book is about, they're flustered and they ruin it. Too many details, the background, they start from the first page to the last page. So I do a lot of thinking and teaching and writing around how authors answer the question, what is your book about?
Wow. We'll have to continue that conversation offline.
And I could share with you a link to some things if you want to share them on Twitter that coach authors to make it easy on themselves.
Okay, that sounds interesting and fascinating. All right, so what is the World Conference of the Professional Speechwriters Association, and how did you become a member? And did you need 3 endorsements from world leaders to get into that organization?
The World Conference. I think that's a conference. So I think, the public speaking community is in sort of phases. There's a national public speaking organization that I'm frankly not part of, where people who do public speaking for a living on their own sort of congregate, learn from each other. I think that's called the NSA. There's Toastmasters, which a lot of people are involved with all around the country, which helps people in particular who are afraid of public speaking. It gets you up there and speaking so you're more comfortable doing it. Then there are people like I am now with a public speaking organization who are hired to come and teach presentation training or media training or general communication training. Like I teach also email training, I teach job interview training. So anything in the realm of communications. I do it because I have this experience, but actually, more truthfully, I love it. I love sharing what I learned. I'm a total nerd about public speaking, and that sounds weird. I understand. But we all nerd out on something, and for some reason, maybe because of the competition I did all through middle school and high school and college, I just nerd out on that stuff.
I guess if you're competitive, you can be competitive about just about anything.
Well, that's true. We've seen those people. Yeah, exactly. It was tough, man. We were in suits and ties and going against each other. And if you get first or second, you move on, or else, I guess it's more like American Idol, really. But you get to a final round, and there's a big audience, and you get a big trophy, and it's a big deal, and you sweat it out.
Nice. All right. So, how should someone choose a story for a speech or a presentation?
Right. Well, let's start with the mistake. If you're giving a speech or a presentation, the mistake is thinking, like a good example is my brother, who's a doctor, and he was about to give a presentation. And his first question was, I need a funny story. I need a story that'll make people laugh or make people giggle or make them happy or make them sad. That's honestly mostly a waste of time. Because your role as a public speaker is not to make them happy, is not to make them sad, is not to make them laugh, is not even to make them like you. If someone comes away from one of your speeches, Mel, and says, I love that Mel. Mel, he was so funny and interesting. And someone asks, well, what was Mel trying to convey about storytelling or anything? I don't remember, but Mel was great. I mean, he was funny, he was knowledgeable, he was interesting, it's a great hat. That's a fail, because as presenters, we are presenting our points, not ourselves. So back to your question, choose a story that illustrates your point. If you ever see a TED Talk, and there are many to choose from, they tell stories all the time. But they often end the story with, I chose that story because it illustrates in a real life setting what happens when we adopt this mindset, let's say a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. They're always telling stories strategically, strategic storytelling, so that the point travels through it so that it has a better impact on the audience. So the bottom line is, don't tell a story to be entertaining, because you are not an entertainer. In fact, we don't even use we don't say speakers perform. We say actors perform, and magicians perform, and singers perform. But what do we say about speakers? they deliver a speech. They don't perform a speech. And in that difference, deliver versus perform, your role is to deliver a point, is to use storytelling, to use authority, to use data, to use reasonability, to use all that Aristotle thing, ethos, logos, and pathos, all the tricks that you have. And I call them tricks not in a bad way, but in a useful way, not in a pejorative way, to make sure one thing happens. Your audience receives that point. And since we know stories are very compelling to an audience and resonant, we can use stories, but stories to make a point, not just to entertain.
Okay. Excuse me. So what mistakes do people make when telling stories in presentations?
Usually they get lost in the details and they tell it chronologically, and that's the longest way to tell a story. Oh, it started on this day, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. And let's talk about the cure for that. They do that because they don't know the driving point of their story. And to find the driving point, you ask yourself, well, what do I want the other person to get out of the story? And it's usually just one idea. Do I want them to get out that these two people, that's a match made in heaven? Do I want them to get out that this invention is going to be revolutionary in changing the world? Or taking on this approach will be more effective? If you start by thinking to yourself, what do I want people to take away? Then that will drive your telling of the story because you're getting to that point. And everything you mentioned about the story should be supporting that point. And anything else sort of subtracts from that point. And sometimes, Mel, I say there's a big difference between need to know and neat to know. You want to stick with the need to know from the story because you're telling that story for a reason. And all the stuff that's neat to know, deprioritize it or don't tell it at all because we want to be concise. Less is more, but also more is less. The more we say, the more convoluted that story is going to be.
Okay. So how should a speaker frame a story?
I think the framing should be not unlike a speech. Like, how do I set up this story, provide the right context so that someone understands the time and the place? Oh, last Friday I was in the cafeteria when. And then like a classic sort of screenplay, you have what they call an inciting incident. What happened? Oh, this thing happened. In that cafeteria, someone made a fuss because they found something, we won't get into detail, on their tray or in their lasagna. And then you want to understand the point you want to make. I was shocked by that, and they changed their policy. Or she decided never to have lasagna again. Or we stopped going to the cafeteria as a result. So you set up the story so we know the time and place. You make the point of the story, what happened that's interesting, and then you talk about all of this very briefly, of course, the impact of that story, what happened as a result. And if you can see it in those three pieces, the important setup and context, what happened, and what the result or impact of that, then you could see how it comes down. You know, Mel, I often say when I help people with their public speaking and I coach them, my job is not to make this more complicated. My job is to actually make it easier on you. Because you see a story as this big complicated thing, I'm going to boil it down to just three things. You go bang, 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 and you're done.
Nice. So you mentioned your brother, who's a doctor, wanting a funny story from you. So should stories in presentation ideally be funny, or is that just some perception that people have?
When I see people recommending humor, it's a little like nails on a chalkboard for two reasons. One, not everybody is funny. Perhaps a minority of people are funny. And by funny, I don't mean necessarily you should go out, in front of a brick wall and do comedy. But I mean are comfortable around humor. If you are comfortable around humor, and that's obvious, or people even know that about you, then tell a story that has a humorous aspect, like you did, Mel, when you gave that toast. There were humorous aspects, but you weren't telling some unrelated joke. you're talking about something you experienced while your son was growing up that happened to be funny, or you said it in a funny way. But here's the two things I want people to take away. One, if you're not funny, don't be funny. Don't be someone other than yourself. Remember, it's not a performance. You want to be authentic to who you are. And here's the good news. If you are not funny, you're not comfortable in humor, or you rack your brain and you think, I can't come up with something funny, this is going to be terrible. A story is more powerful than a joke. A joke has 3 seconds of, huh. A story has 5 minutes of, oh. And that will stick with them. And it's hard to make a point through a joke, because often there's the irony, people have to think about it, give it cognitive time. Oh, I see, because. But if you tell a story, not only does it make your point, but it does the thing the joke does. It breaks the ice, it makes you human, and it makes you relatable. In the end, with my brother, we did not find a funny doctor joke. Instead, he shared a moment from Patch Adams, the movie, where the doctor was on trial and begged his fellow colleagues, his physicians, to understand that you're not just treating a disease, you're treating a human. Now, that's not funny, but that's powerful. And I would suggest that him choosing that moment from that movie had a more powerful impact on his audience than if he had them giggle for a moment from a joke.
So is there anything funny about doctors other than their handwriting?
What I originally wanted him to do, when he really wanted something funny, I was going to have him do this joke from Airplane. Remember that movie where someone goes, this person's in the hospital. Really? What is it? Well, it's a big building with patients, but that's not what's important right now. So you can find humor in almost anything, even doctoring. I mean, in all the jobs we've had, there have been moments of humor. So you can, but again, don't do it unless you're comfortable around humor, and consider that a story may be more powerful.
Okay. So how should you go about picking a story? Somebody who's got to give a toast for their son or daughter's wedding, how should they go about picking a story for that occasion?
Right. Sometimes when I encourage people to use stories, they think movies. Oh, it's got to be cinematic. Or you see these weird things online where you're like, good storytelling. All right, well, you have to have a protagonist, and the protagonist has to have a challenge, and the challenge has to get to this level, and then you throw rocks at them in the tree, and wow, that is some real hard thinking about the story, the 1.5 minute story in your presentation. I would say first, don't think of it in a cinematic way. Think of it in a very small way, as almost an example. An example is a story. A case study is a story. Data scientists would even argue that data tells a story. And we often talk about data visualization. That's the process of telling a story through data. So think of it in a small way. And, when I want to encourage people to think of stories, I give examples like something you heard on NPR last week, something your 6-year-old said to you while you were in the car, something you observed a neighbor doing that reminded you of today's point. So think of it that way. I think that's more important than saying choose this story because of its elements versus that story. I would say pick a story that's true, pick a story that's short, and pick the story that best illustrates or at least introduces the point you're about to make, so there's connection.
Okay, that's great advice. So what should a person avoid when they're telling stories?
Number one, adjectives, especially useless adjectives. And many adjectives are useless. In my work, I invented this term called badjectives. And badjectives are adjectives. They're bad verbs too. Badjectives are adjectives that are so broad that they are virtually meaningless. Now, if I say that an approach is great, or this thing my brother did is great, or this story about the bunny rabbit did this great thing. Well, listen, I had a great tuna fish sandwich yesterday. And certainly we can't apply the same adjective to this amazing telling story that I would to this tuna fish sandwich I had yesterday. There must be something wrong about that adjective, and there is. It's so broad it doesn't mean anything. And they say this in advertising all the time, and I've even seen it in movies, where an editor cuts out all the adjectives. And that's not just to cut out adjectives, but it's to force you to say something more specific. So if I say this approach will make us more efficient, and that's not a bad adjective, that's pretty clear. But what would be better if I say this approach will allow us to save money, which we can put into research and development so we can guarantee our financial future. Now notice there were no adjectives in the second version. If you want to get rid of adjectives and badjectives because they're so broad and they say so little, the trick to it, again, is not just saying don't do it. That rarely works. But saying to yourself, ask why. So this adventure was great. Why? Oh, this adventure was great because it really illustrated the drive of this protagonist. Aha. So then you say, well, this story was great because it illustrated the drive of the protagonist. Now you don't even need great anymore. Let's get rid of that adjective. This story illustrated the amazing drive of that protagonist. Now I used amazing there, and that's a adjective also. So the idea is to reduce, don't necessarily get rid of all of them. I'm not totally anti-adjective, but look for them and say to yourself, if I replace this adjective with why, I'm going to say something more specific and thus more powerful. And one other trick, Mel, that I find really useful that I don't see as much. I encourage speakers and writers and storytellers to do what's called an and audit. And that means literally in your writing to look for the word and. And often you'll find an and connecting two synonyms when one will have done. Two concepts when one will have done. We're just so used to saying, oh, that was so amazing and thrilling. Do you really need both? And let's say you have two and one's more important than the other. Will your readers pick the wrong one? You know, what I like to say in public speaking training is you say a lot of things, they'll remember nothing. You say a few things, they'll remember a few things. You say one thing, and they will remember everything. So stick to one idea, one adjective, one description, or one at a time. And that's the best way to make sure you're not giving your audience too much or a useless comparison between two words when one will have done just the same.
Okay, what about in the wedding reception type of setting? Somebody who's not a professional speaker, speaks once occasionally. What type of adjectives do you hear, and what can replace those that can make the occasion more enjoyable for everybody participating?
Right. Know if you say these two are a perfect match, that's something that is so, I don't want to say trite, let's say used, that it won't be memorable. And obviously they're a good match. It's almost a truism. So think about what makes them a good match. Oh, this person has this quality of this, and I know this person has this quality of that. So let's imagine together, when you bring together those wonderful qualities, the kind of pairing that'll make, and for the parents in the room, the kind of children that might make, and grandchildren someday. So see how I took something that's very common, but I made it more specific to that moment. So I'm not saying don't use adjectives, but try to avoid these adjectives. Great, very good, awesome, perfect, meaningful, interesting. And as you look through your speech, if you do write it out, just audit it for those adjectives and for those ands. Now, the general advice with a toast is to give one telling story. Again, not a story necessarily to entertain, but a story that's very telling about your child. And maybe you do know stories about your child's partner, but their parents are probably going to tell that story. So think of it in terms of your experience with that child. Tell a story about that child that really conveys what's interesting and unique about that child, and then speak to your perspective on the combination of qualities and approaches and mindsets and abilities that this union creates. So see, it's again, 1, 2, 3. Don't see it as 800 words. How do I start? See it as I'm going to accomplish these 2 things. My experience, the setup, what makes them complementary, and the story. And again, make sure that story illustrates what you're talking about.
Okay, that's, again, great advice. So I've only got a couple more questions here to wind it up, and I want to make them specific and personal to you. So let's get a little closer to home for you. So I saw in your bio that you live in New Jersey. Do you know Bruce Springsteen and John Bon Jovi?
As you know, I grew up in Texas, and then I went to NYU. And in my freshman sophomore year at NYU, when I told people from Texas, they would go, "Oh, do you know Bubba?" And Bubba was like in Dallas or El Paso or in the Panhandle, as far away from me as Pennsylvania is from DC or whatever it is. So no, I don't know any of them personally. I'm lucky if I know my neighbors. I am proud, though, of both being in the home place of the boss and John Bon Jovi.
Are you fans of the two of them?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, maybe they'll be listening to this podcast and they'll say, "Oh, I know Joel," or "I don't know Joel yet, but I need to know him." They'll come and introduce themselves and give you some concert tickets.
Yeah, or maybe they'll be like, "Wait a minute, that book and that guy, or that's that guy."
Yeah, he's our neighbor. Yeah, and if you get an extra ticket, let me know, because I'd love to go to that show. Either one of them.
I will.
All right, so let's wind it down with this last question here. What's the best day you've ever had at work? You seem to be doing something that you're passionate about, but what's the best day you've ever had in your job?
I would say the best day I've ever had at work. Now I'm going to go to a previous job because we're talking about fulfillment here. There's a magazine called Time for Kids magazine. Many kids got it in school. They got Scholastic or they got Time for Kids. Time for Kids magazine is Time magazine, but for kids. And in 2000, I was hired to be the executive producer of the Time for Kids website. And that was a very fulfilling job because not only I worked at Nickelodeon for 2 years online, and working for Time for Kids seemed so much more relevant because it was about the real world, not the world of SpongeBob. But I got to be alongside what we called our kid reporter, our Time for Kids kid reporter, as they went to the Democratic National Convention of 2000. And it was tremendously fulfilling in the moments where people started to treat her. She was 12 years old. She's now an avant-garde artist, by the way. Started by treating her as a kid. Oh, do I need to describe to you what a Democratic party is and our system? And she knew about delegates and all that. And she knew it backwards and forwards. And she asked tough questions, knowledgeable questions, but also questions that related, because she was an ambassador for children, so that related to her world and her future. And she blew them away. And I think these people second-guessed their assumptions about kids. And I think that idea that you have a preconceived notion about someone, whether because they're young or they're old or they have a disability or they're this color or they're that color, we need to do everything we can to explode those preconceived notions and, frankly, prejudices so that we can benefit from each other. So in answer to your question, that was fulfilling because I got to see with my own eyes and witness the elevation of people's understands of what kids can think, understand, and do. It doesn't mean they should be able to vote at 12, but they can play a role and have an informed opinion about the political process.
That's awesome. That is a really uplifting way of concluding this episode. So my guest this week has been presenter, communications trainer, and writer, Joel Schwartzberg. Joel, thank you for being here and sharing your stories. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
It's been a pleasure here too, Mel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So that's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.